Emmaus, a contemplative theological retreat and workshop, deepening the mystery of the disciples' journey to Emmaus, deepening our own journey into resurrection faith. Hello, my name is Father Kevin Burke, and it's my privilege to be with you for this second part of our retreat and a look at the second half of Luke's famous narrative of the appearance of Jesus after his death to two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then the supper that ensues afterwards. We will focus in the second part on the supper and on the way that the supper has been received in the history of Christian art. I want to look at several paintings of the story of the supper at Emmaus. Interestingly, one of the most frequently painted scenes from all of the New Testament, along with the birth and the death of Jesus on the cross, along with the Annunciation story, which clearly is a favorite among painters. This story receives so much attention from so many great artists that it's worth not only looking at the story, but at the way they present the story, and to see what insights might come to us through their eyes. It's interesting to note that in the New Testament, there's no attempt to actually see the resurrection. There's no story that tells of Jesus coming out of the tomb, for example. We don't actually see that event. What we see, of course, are the effects of that event. First of all, the empty tomb. And each of the Gospels begins there, in a graveyard. And that's where resurrection faith dawns for us in our own experiences of loss and disappointment, the awful experience of the death of a loved one. It's precisely there the resurrection faith can dawn and does begin. So the Gospels don't attempt to see the resurrection, but what they attempt to do is show us a new way of seeing. And this is also true of the artists who meditate on the gospel passages. They are attempting to show us a new way of seeing how the reality of faith takes a hold of us and allows us to see reality, the reality of our world and of our own lives, and the reality of God in our lives, to see these profound realities in a new way. And so we'll look at a number of different depictions of Emmaus. This is a very contemporary depiction that is actually a study or a variation on a painting by Rembrandt from several centuries ago. But we will begin back in about the beginning of the 1500s with the emergence of what we might call the High Renaissance, and painters such as Albrecht Dürer, who paints Christ at Emmaus, and in this woodcut, it's not actually a painting but a woodcut, in which we see the disciples on either side of Jesus and another person behind, and Jesus filled with light. And of course, that's one of the great themes of the Emmaus story. And the artist will try to show us how Jesus, in that moment, both looked like Jesus. He was recognizable as who the disciples had known, but something is different. Something has changed. So this is a very early depiction of Jesus at Emmaus. The great Renaissance painter Titian also painted the supper at Emmaus in about the 1530s. And here, a kind of a more colorful and clearly a painting. Once again, you notice that, and this is something that's actually deep in medieval contemplative spirituality. The whole idea that the gospel scenes are open and that we ourselves can find ourselves in the gospel scenes. And one of the ways different artists, going all the way back to the early part of the 16th century, artists like Titian and Dürer will show us not just the people that are in the gospel story, the two disciples and Jesus, but they start to fill in other persons. Here we have, it seems, a waiter and a servant girl with a pitcher of water or wine to help serve the table. Oh, and you notice under the table, the family pet, a dog. These details are not in the scriptural account. They come from the imagination of the artist, as does the background, which is far away from first century Palestine and looks much more like the reality of the artist than of the disciples of Jesus who saw him on the road to Emmaus. But already we're beginning to see how artists teach us to see in a new way. Here's a much later painting, this one from late in the 19th century. Pascal d'Agnan-Bovary shows Christ and the disciples at Emmaus, and of course what dominates this picture is the light that seems to emanate from Jesus. Another kind of classical scene, and oh, by the way, notice we have even more people in the picture. It seems like the family, and now a servant lady, a waitress who's bringing the bread to the table or bringing other food to the table. But I want to go back in time to a couple of classical artists and their depiction of the Emmaus story and of the supper at Emmaus, because these are truly classical paintings. They come more from the Baroque period. Here we have the great Italian artist Caravaggio showing the supper, and of course there's a lot of food on the table. Here's a new detail. And a servant or a waiter who is apparently waiting at the table. And we get a sense of the event of recognition on the part of the disciples by their motion, less an attempt to show the light that comes from Jesus than the reaction of the disciples, their astonishment, their need to get to their feet. Now here's an interesting point. Caravaggio painted this painting, we think, in 1601. He goes back to this theme 5 years later, and in 1606 gives us this version of the Supper at Emmaus. Notice now that the waiter, or the man who is kind of the host of the dinner, has moved to the other side of the painting and is now accompanied by a woman who is helping to bring the food to the table. Notice too, the colors have been toned down and the dramatic motion of the disciples has been intensified. Notice the disciple on the right peering closely at the face of Jesus, his hand almost touching the hand of Jesus, his heart, as it were, leaping out of his body. Another great artist who spends time, in fact, over and over, comes back to the theme of the supper at Emmaus, is the great Netherlands painter Rembrandt. This painting from 1600, so about the same time as Caravaggio, is painting in Italy. Rembrandt, in the northern part of Europe, is painting this imaginative scene, again with a fourth, somewhat dim personage in the background on the right. It looks like a servant woman, a waitress, but we can't be quite certain. The hands of the figures are a little less distinct, but the light is striking, and especially for someone like Rembrandt. Here's another version of this event. This is from 1628, so almost 30 years later. And notice what Rembrandt is doing here. He has, in a sense, placed the light within Jesus. And the event of recognition has been intensified in the figure, on the face of the figure directly in front of Jesus. There are other paintings by Rembrandt. This one from 1648, with several women helping to serve the table. And the scene is much darker. It's interesting that the light seems to have shifted almost over to those who are waiting at the table. In other words, those who stand in for us as we enter the story, as the light begins to fall on our own lives, on our own hearts. And another beautiful depiction by Rembrandt, a similar kind of setting as the previous painting, and painted at the same time in 1648, but with richer colors, with a sense of a tapestry that seems to have been pulled back like a window blind on the left side of the painting. It's almost as if we had the opportunity to slide the window covering to the side so that we could enter the story, so that we could see the light that shines on those who meet Jesus after his resurrection. One final painting by Rembrandt. This one is in some ways the classical painting, the one that shows up in many of the art books. Again, different than those before, the way the light falls. Rembrandt, who is so attentive to light and shadow, to darkness and light. And his faces would oftentimes be bathed in light. The revelatory reality of the human face. And in the case of Jesus, the more than revelatory reality, revealing not just the human Jesus, but the divine presence within Jesus. I want to look at one other painting. This one also from the Baroque period, from the Spanish Baroque artist, Diego Velázquez. The Kitchen Maid, it's often titled, or The Kitchen Maid at the Supper at Emmaus. There's so much to see in this painting, so much to consider in the light of the other paintings that we've seen. Perhaps the most surprising thing about this painting is that the actual encounter between Jesus and the disciples seems to be happening in another room, off on the left-hand side of the painting, at some distance from the focal point of the painting. The event is being experienced, as it were, from the kitchen. And the light is falling on the kitchen maid, on her hat, and on the jug that she's about to bring in, and on her face. So what's astonishing about this painting is that the movement that is so profound in the history of spirituality, that wants to take the story and bring us into the story, that movement has now reached a high point here. Notice the kitchen maid, the person who's not actually mentioned in the gospel story, the figure who is supplied by the artist's imagination, or the imagination of the one praying over this scene. She who is not named is the absolute center of the painting. The focus is on her. And notice this, she's a maid. She's not some important person in the usual sense of the word. She's certainly not one of the leaders of the religious people, even leaders of the movement of Jesus. It's not Peter or James or John who's at the center of the painting. It's a young servant. And not just a servant, a young woman, a marginal figure, and not just a woman, but a black woman, a woman of perhaps Moorish descent in Spain at this time. It is this woman who would be an outsider to the usual power structures of society, a woman who would not be named, who is at the very center of the action. And the light, which seems to emanate from the room where Jesus is, and we can assume from Jesus himself, is shining on her face. and casting her shadow on the wall. This amazing painting, as we look more closely at her face and the intensity of her gaze, what is she experiencing? Is she experiencing a moment of recognition? Is she seeing, as if for the first time, who it is that these disciples have brought home with them? Notice some of the other details. Here is the room in the back of the painting, and the far left in the back of the painting, and we see Jesus and one of the two disciples. So this painting actually has three figures and the hand of the other disciple. But the third figure, of course, is the servant. We look again at the painting as a whole and notice the dishes that she's about to bring in. Notice all the kitchen utensils and even the cloth that she would use to wipe the table, painted with such careful detail. Look again at her and her shadow, the light that falls on her that brings her to awareness. And the jugs shimmering, as it were, with resurrection light. Resurrection does not take away the shadows. It gives a new focal point for where the light falls and how the light is received. So I want to now read a poetic reflection on the servant girl at Emmaus. This is a poem by the great American poet Denise Levertov from her book Breathing the Water. And it's almost as if Levertov has put herself into the place of this young black woman and entered her experience. And she writes, she listens, holding her breath. Surely that voice is his, the one who had looked at her once across the crowd as no one ever had looked, had seen her, had spoken as if to her. Surely those hands were his, taking the platter of bread from hers just now. Hands he had laid on the dying and made them well. Surely that face. The man they had crucified for sedition and blasphemy. The man whose body disappeared from its tomb. The man, it was rumored now, some women had seen this morning alive. Those who had brought this stranger home to their table don't recognize yet with whom they sit. But she, in the kitchen, absently touching the wine jug she's to take in, a young black servant intently listening, swings round and sees the light around him and is sure. Resurrection dawns. It doesn't come in a blinding flash. It dawns slowly in our lives, over time, in our behavior as we enact our faith, in our own love for others. Resurrection dawns. In our own wrestling with life and death, resurrection dawns. And it dawns for each of us. The gift of faith is not particular. It is not reserved just to those who spend many years studying the scriptures or many years is in service as a priest or some other official of the religious tradition. No, It is for everyone. And in some ways, especially for those who are otherwise unseen, like the young woman in this painting. Resurrection isn't something we see. It's something we see through. The gospel writers don't try to see the event of resurrection. They try to take us into the action, into the narrative, the story about how Jesus appeared to those who loved him and changed their way of seeing. How Jesus wants to enter our story, our lives, and help us see in a new way. There's one last thing that we can think about with this amazing story. The painting by Velázquez, as in the other painting, the Caravaggio painting with the very richly laid table, or the Rembrandt paintings in the great big room, the formal dining room. All of these paintings help us to remember that what we are seeing is a dinner. But Luke is very clear in showing us this is not just a dinner. The story of Jesus appearing to the disciples on the road to Emmaus is like a Eucharist. The entire story, without ever saying it, simply engages and enacts the essential rhythm and dynamics of the Mass. Think about it. The story begins with a confession, like the penitential rite at the beginning of Mass, except a confession not focused on sin, but on grief, on the sadness of the disciples who lost Jesus, who saw him killed, and whose hearts are broken. And it is a very important point, because so often we think that the heart of the matter is God addressing our sin, but the heart of the matter is God addressing our pain. And it's important for us to see, as we place ourselves in the story, that God is not in the first place ashamed of our guilt, but moved with deep compassion and mercy by our suffering. So the Eucharist begins with that confession and then moves into the liturgy of the Word. And there we have the story of the road that Sister Julia talked about earlier, where the disciples talk with Jesus and he opens the scriptures to them. Wouldn't you have liked to have been at that homily? Wouldn't you have liked to have heard that scripture lesson? And it's like the liturgy, where the liturgy of the Word reaches a high point. And then there's a turn in the story, in the action of the Eucharist. We call it the offertory. In this story, it's the invitation. It is the disciples of Jesus stopping and saying, thinking he wants to go on, and saying to him, the night has almost come. Please come in and stay with us. And so Jesus comes in to their home or to the inn where they're staying. We don't know what that place is, but Jesus accepts the invitation. Their offering is accepted. And then Jesus, and Luke is very careful here to use the exact same verbs in the exact same order that he uses them 2 chapters before in the so-called Last Supper, where Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to them. Those actions, the dynamic actions of Eucharist, are at the heart of this story and at the heart of the resurrection dynamism that allows us to begin to see in a new way. Where might we meet resurrection now? Well, certainly one place is in that Eucharistic liturgy, which is always a celebration of resurrection life, of God bringing Jesus, and in Jesus, all of creation to fullness, to life with God. And that liturgy which moves from the broken-hearted place of the disciples in the beginning, through the narration of the story, through their action of generosity to invite him in, their hospitality to make him their guest, and his hospitality of breaking the bread and taking the dinner to a whole new level. And then what happens? The disciples go back to Jerusalem. Jesus is no longer visible as he had been moments earlier. The gospel writer tells us, whereupon Jesus vanished from their sight. Their eyes were open. They recognized him. And then he's suddenly no longer on the stage. And they, with hearts burning within them, set out for Jerusalem to tell the others what they had seen. The very movement of the Mass is to go out from the Mass, to engage in a mission, to share good news with others. That is the essential story of the Eucharist. That is the essential story of the gospel at Emmaus. And that is the story we enact every time we receive communion. And so as we ponder this gospel passage and place it in context with other passages and other images, and especially the memories and the stories of our own lives, we can know as surely as the young maid in this painting and in Levertov's poem, we can know that same sense of sureness because the light has dawned in us.